Hello, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. My name is Laura, and today's video we're going to talk about all the books that I read in the month of February. I have quite the stack of books to get through today, so we're gonna try to jump right in. I will say that two books that I'm gonna talk about with you today are actually from January, but I'll explain that after we go over some of the reading stats from February. So just know that those two books are kind of like bonus books that I'll be talking about, and they're not included in any of these stats. In the month of February, I read 7 novels, 1 graphic novel, and 1 short story. The main format that I used was physical books. I read 6 of them in the physical book format, and then I had 1 book that I listened to an audiobook, 1 that I read in my Kindle app on my phone, and then 1 that was a hybrid of I had the physical copy and listened to the audiobook kind of in tandem. The age category for all of these books was that I read 2 middle grade books and 1 adult. I had no YA books that I read for February. And then what I would say the primary genre for all of the books that I read, of course, like some of these books have kind of like a mixed genre, or they might fall into several different categories, but I think the primary genre for these are 2 romance, 2 mystery thriller, 1 horror, 1 memoir, 2 historical fiction, and 1 fantasy. That's pretty much all the stats that I keep track of for myself, but like I said, we have 2 books that we need to talk to before I can get into my reviews and ratings for the books that I read in February. So back in January, I had gathered a few books from the library that were on my want to read list over on Goodreads and had been on my want to read list for quite a while, and specifically what I would consider kind of like my most anticipated. Where it all went wrong is that I started it in January. Some readathons that I really wanted to participate in came up in February. So by the time I got around to getting back to some of those books and looking at the footage that I had for that project, the vlog was feeling really sporadic, the footage that I had for it, and kind of chaotic. And I want to only put out like my best quality, the best that I can do anyway for these videos for you. And so I just decided I'm just gonna scrap the books. Of course, I could have just pretended like this never happened and never brought any of this up to you guys, and you never would have even known that I read these 2 books, but I have to talk about them because one of them was my first 5-star read of 2024, and the other one really has potential to be my biggest disappointment of the year. I know, already. Should we get in with the good news or the bad news first? Let's start it off on a good note. Okay, so let's talk about my first 5-star rating of the year, and that was Babel by R.F. Kuang. If for some reason you've never heard of Babel, I don't know how that would be possible if you watch a lot of BookTube, because I feel like it's been talked about a lot, both from people who loved it and people who hated it. I've seen actually a lot of people that have DNF'd this book, and I can understand why. We'll get to that in just a minute. If you're not familiar with the plot of Babel, I will kind of briefly set that up for you, but I mean, it's a chunky book and there's so much detail in this book, which is one of the reasons I loved it. This follows the main character, Robin Swift, that's not his real name actually, first of all. He was living in China, in Canton specifically, and he was orphaned. His family got sick with cholera and they all ended up dying, and he was rescued, we'll put that lightly, by Professor Lovell. Professor Lovell then takes Robin under his wing and decides that he's going to educate him and train him basically to be able to go to school at Oxford University in Britain, where he will learn the art of translation. As soon as he gets to Oxford, he meets a group of other people. I love his relationship with Remy, which is kind of like his roommate or dorm mate. The fantasy part of the story comes into play with this silver working that happens in the Tower of Babel at the same place where the translation is happening. We come to find out that Britain is kind of on a power trip, you know, with feeling like they have the power of both through the art of translation and collecting all this silver, but they are kind of running out of their source, and so it develops into this war with other countries, essentially, is the direction that this starts to go. And so at that point, you know, Robin and his group of friends, being part of Oxford and part of the translation, part of their job essentially as these students at Oxford becomes the people who are translating these silver bars and doing this all for Britain. And so there's an underground society that they become part of, and they kind of get to a point where they have to choose between the comfortable life that they're living at Oxford University or trying to disrupt the imbalance of power that Britain has over these other countries in the world, basically. This is a fantastically detailed story. What I love about this is, I mean, everything, honestly. For me, a 5-star read means like there's almost nothing that I would change about it. The beginning part of this, I can see where people might get a little bit bored. She goes into so much depth and detail about the art of translation and silver working and just how that all works. So I could see somebody kind of getting bored with that, but it's a dark academia type of story. So we're learning about all of that at the same time that Robin and his friends are learning about it. So I thought that that was interesting. I liked the way that that worked. I was really interested in the themes of like racism and colonization and things like that that are explored in this book. There is a plot point where like this entire book just like is flipped on its head. It was shocking to me and mind-blowing, and as soon as that plot point hits, the characters are scrambling and it's chaos for all of them, and it feels like chaos as the reader. It just was a fantastic reading experience in my opinion. So this was my first 5-star of the year. Now let's get to the sad part. The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, also a 5-star prediction for me, and this was a DNF. I made this, I don't know, I think about 150, 160 pages or so. The Song of Achilles follows Patroclus and Achilles, and we're mostly in Patroclus's head, and they are, you know, companions that are getting ready for the Trojan War, essentially. I didn't make it to the Trojan War part, so maybe that gets better at that point. It's a Greek mythology retelling, and I think that's maybe where some of my misconception about what this book was going to be, like maybe where my expectations just weren't set quite right. But I did even put this down and picked up a different book and then tried to come back to it later. I tried switching and listening to it on the audiobook because I thought maybe the writing just wasn't doing it for me. And I found the narrator to be really like kind of monotone and boring as well, which wasn't helping because that was my main issue with this, is that I was so bored. The relationship between Patroclus and Achilles just was not working for me because I had the same critique for their relationship that I do in a lot of romance novels, and why I have DNF'd more romance novels than any other genre. And the reason for that in this book is mostly because their relationship was primarily like 90%, I would say, based on their physical attraction to each other. And they're very young at the part of the book that I was in. Maybe they grow older, maybe their romance blossoms into something more mature than that, but I mean, come on, I remember being 13 years old and I wasn't just like physically attracted to other people just for their looks alone. I was attracted to their sense of humor, or we had things in common, things that we liked. I mean, from a very young age, I have never been like just attracted to somebody only because of their physical appearance. And that's all that we get in Patroclus's head, at least in the part of the book that I was able to get through. I also really wasn't vibing with the writing style for Madeline Miller. I will say, like, her prose is beautiful. Her dialogue is the worst thing that I have ever read. I'm not going to spoil anything for you. Trust me, without like any of the prose that's in between the dialogue, you're not going to be able to get much from this. Who trained you? My father, a little. No one else? No. Fight me? No, of course not. Fight me? I don't want to. I dare you. You don't have any weapons. I'll get them. I will not. Do not ask me again. I will ask you again. You cannot forbid me. Come back. Come back. Are you afraid? No, I am not afraid. You should be. Do you see what I mean? Am I crazy for thinking that that is like the most boring and flat dialogue? I mean, I've read children's books that have more complex conversations between the characters than that, you know? I just couldn't get past it. It doesn't get any better. I skimmed towards the end to think like, well, maybe that's just because they're young and she's trying to write like young people would talk, although that's not how young people talk anyway. It doesn't get any better. Like, I skimmed ahead and kind of spoiled some things for myself, but that's okay because I won't be finishing that one. I know that's a very beloved book. Maybe if I would have stuck with it, maybe if I loved Greek mythology more, I just don't think that that was the book for me. Now we can get into the books that I read in the month of February, starting with Romantic Comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld. This is a romance, but I don't know that I would really consider it like a rom-com. There wasn't a lot of like funny parts, like the funny banter and different things that you would think of when you think of a rom-com. I think the title really comes more into play in that the main character, Sally, is a comedy writer for a Saturday Night Live style live comedy show that airs on Saturday night. It's called The Night Owls. So Sally Mills is working at The Night Owls, and the very first part of this book it really is just about that show production process and Sally Mills and her part of it. And she does meet who later will become her romantic interest, Noah. He is a musician host for the show, and so that's kind of how they meet, but there really is like no romantic involvement between the two of them in the first part of the book. And then it moves into the second part of the book, which is exclusively emails between Sally and Noah during the COVID pandemic. And that's where their relationship kind of starts to blossom. And then finally in the third part is where we actually get to see them together as a couple and find out, like, are they going to end up together or not? I don't want to spoil that for you. The third part of this book I really enjoyed. The middle part with the emails was okay, but if I'm being honest, I skimmed a lot of that part. And the first part, I just felt like it was interesting in a way because it felt like you were reading about what happens during like a Saturday Night Live show production. But I also felt like if that's what I wanted to read, I would just read a nonfiction book about Saturday Night Live show production, you know? So it wasn't necessarily my favorite as far as a romance goes. I gave it a 3-star rating, so it was okay. But then the next book that I read is actually my favorite romance of all time at this point. This is Happy Place by Emily Henry, and I just loved this book. It was a 5-star read. I'll just go ahead and tell you right now. This follows our two main characters, Harriet and Wynne, as well as their friend group. So Harriet and Wynne are getting ready to go on a vacation with their friend group, 2 other couples specifically, that are all in this very close-knit friend group that they have known for a very long time. They've kind of grown up together, if you will, from like a young college age, kind of stepping into more of like adulthood versus young adulthood. So I like the conversations about, you know, how our relationships and our friendships even change as we get older, as more responsibilities come into play, as life gets in the way, and how our friend groups kind of drift apart and how to handle that. So I love that there was like that whole side conversation in addition to the romance, but I don't think that it took away from the romance for me. Harriet and Wynne, however, are getting ready to go on this vacation, and the problem is that they have actually broken up a few months before. And like I said, because these friends are, you know, busy with life and they're kind of doing more adulting and talking to each other a little bit less than they used to, they haven't told their friends yet that they've broken up. And so they decide that for the sake of everybody, they would go on this one last trip, and this would be their last time together. They're doing like a fake dating essentially and pretending like they're together, with the plan that after the vacation is over, they would kind of come clean with their friends and go on their separate ways. But it's very clear from the beginning that they are not completely over each other, that they still have questions that they need to ask each other, kind of this unresolved history with each other. And so I love the close proximity that kind of forces them to communicate with each other. So there is like the miscommunication trope that I know some people don't like, but I think it's realistic, and I love the way that Emily Henry handled that and talks about it, because I think that it happens in a lot of couples. What I really loved about this though, my favorite thing about what this book did, is how it was structured, because we have the main timeline of Harriet and Wynne and their friends on this vacation in the current timeline, but then we also are getting this dual timeline of getting all of the backstory. We get to see Harriet and Wynne from the time that they first get together when they were younger, and kind of how their relationship grew, where things went wrong, and in both of the two timelines, kind of progress and build up to this ultimate climax that I just felt was so effective. At the moment that they're breaking up in the past timeline and we're seeing what caused them to break up in the first place, in the current timeline they're having that moment where they're hashing it out. That inevitable fight happens where they're asking each other those questions that they've been holding back and getting that, you know, unresolved conflict that they had with each other brought to the surface. I just felt like the way that she lined that up so perfectly was really successful for me. I loved them so much. I will be thinking about these characters for a very long time, and yeah, this is definitely my favorite Emily Henry book, and I think my favorite romance book that I've read so far. The next book that I read was Joyland by Stephen King. This is a mystery horror mashup, but I do think it airs a lot more on the mystery side, although I will go ahead and say that one of my major critiques of this book is that it wasn't mystery enough or horror enough. Like, I wanted more in at least one of those directions, or both. Especially with a cover like that. Like, doesn't that give off like 80s horror vibes just with this cover alone? This follows our main character, Devin, who is a college student who goes to work for this theme park during the summer called Joyland. And there he kind of learns how to work at a theme park. He actually becomes the theme park mascot, where they dress up, I think it was a dog costume, you know, like at Disney World, how they have the characters that walk around, or Six Flags, or like any of those theme parks. That is what Devin's primary job was. He also operated some of the equipment. So there was a lot of talk about just like how the theme parks work, like on the back end. King goes into a lot of details about stuff like that. Like, he does not leave out the details in any of the books that he writes. But something that happened at this theme park before Devin started working there is that a woman was murdered on one of the rides. And so this story is now that she is haunting this particular ride at the theme park. So I guess that's really where the only horror element comes into this, is a little bit of that paranormal, but we really don't even get much of that. And I was kind of disappointed about that part of it. I will say that I love Devin. Like, I just felt like he was such a sweet main character. He really seemed to, you know, enjoy his job, and he really enjoyed all of the kids that, you know, kind of came and he got to interact with whenever he was dressed up as the mascot. He was really good at that job. It was so sweet that to see a young college boy who really cared for the children and, you know, cared for their well-being. And then he meets this one boy in particular who is battling some chronic illness. He befriends this little boy and his mother, that's Mike and Annie, and so they become a key part towards the end of this book as well. Devin and some of his friends that he's working for at Joyland are trying to solve the mystery of the girl who was murdered. I don't know, it was okay. Like, I just felt like, again, I wanted more from the mystery element. It seemed a lot more about like just Devin working at the theme park than anything else. And so, not that it was bad. I gave this like a 3.5 rating. I still enjoyed it. I think King is just a good writer no matter what he tries to write. Overall, I'd say if you like Stephen King, it's worth the time reading it if you haven't read this one yet, but it's definitely not going to be my favorite of his. Next, I read The Invention of Hugo Cab by Brian Selznick. So if you remember from January, I read Big Tree by Brian Selznick. That's his newer graphic novel. And my only complaint for Big Tree, I thought that was a cute story, but I didn't love like the graphic illustrations. And this one, I will say, has really beautiful graphic illustrations. Let's see. Like, I loved the graphics for this one. I thought that was really, really cool. Hugo Cab is a historical fiction. There's a little bit of fantasy, a little bit of mystery element to this as well, but Hugo Cab is basically a young boy who has been orphaned and living on his own in this train station, like kind of behind the walls, and he's responsible for like taking care of the clocks, but nobody really knows that he's there and that's what he does. He's having to like steal from people just to survive. And then he kind of gets mixed up with this drawing that he has that was his father's, of this mechanical man, this kind of toy. And he kind of makes it his life mission to try to rebuild this mechanical man that his father had this like drawing or diagram of. And as he's doing that, he meets this older gentleman who is essentially claiming that that diagram was stolen from him and that it was his invention. This ended up being like a 3-star read for me. Like I said, I really loved the graphic illustrations. I just didn't fall in love with the characters or the plot, and I felt like the storyline was a little bit jumpy, like there wasn't a nice flow to it. I got a little bit confused on what was going on at times. I don't know, I just felt like it was okay, but it's definitely not super memorable for me. There are people that really enjoy this one, so if it sounds interesting to you, pick it up. If nothing else, the illustrations are beautiful, and it doesn't take very long to get through either because it's a middle grade graphic novel, even though it's very chunky. There are a lot of photos and a lot of, you know, pages with very few words on it, so it won't take you much time to read it all. The next book that I finished was this short story that I read, and this was Ankle Snatcher by Grady Hendrix. This is one of the Amazon original stories. They have put out several collections of short stories for different genres. They just did like the romance short story collection with authors like Ashley Poston and Abby Jimenez, like the Meet Cute short story collection. Ankle Snatcher by Grady Hendrix is part of the Creature feature, so more of like a horror short story collection, and it was free for Amazon Prime users. It was a very quick read. I read it in one setting and absolutely loved it. It was a 4.5 star for me. As always, this is like a campy horror. I don't want to tell you too much about the plot because it is so short that I don't want to give anything away, but the setup of it is that the main character, Marcus, is this young man who is on a date with a girl. I think it's like their second date, and she kind of shares a part of her past that's, you know, not so pleasant, and he decides that he wants to open up to her about a darker part of his past, which is that his father killed his mother when he was 6 years old, and his father blamed that on the boogeyman or the ankle snatcher. And ever since then, as Marcus has grown up, he doesn't go to sleep with the lights off because his father told him that when you go to sleep with the lights off, if your feet touch the ground while it's dark in the room, that's when the ankle snatcher can come and grab you. I don't want to give away any more of the plot point than that, but just know that that's kind of Marcus's backstory, and he's on a date with his woman. Things happen, and let me just say that Grady Hendrix jumps straight into the horror. It takes almost no time at all for this to get really, like, the body horror in this was so vivid, almost to the point where it was almost too much for me, but I was able to get through it. But Grady Hendrix also throws in like his little bit of humor in this, which I really love. I need a little bit of humor in a horror story. But what I really love the most about Ankle Snatcher is the same thing that I loved about How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix, is that he is able to create this other layer. Like, there's this surface of this ankle snatcher and these things going on, people being murdered. That's like the surface level horror, but then there's a whole underlying sense of horror and a deeper topic that we're exploring here. Are there people that are in prison that maybe were wrongly accused? Maybe their story didn't sound right, it sounded crazy, but maybe it was true. Maybe they really didn't do the crime that they committed, or maybe they are just a type of person that has this monster inside of them that maybe even they don't realize it themselves. I love the exploration of that topic, and I thought this was really well done. The only reason it wasn't like a 5-star for me is that I wanted a little bit more. We shift from one setting at the beginning part of the story to another setting, and that shift felt like really abrupt for me. I know that it's hard to make that smooth transition in such a short amount of time. I think Grady Hendrix probably did that the best that he could, but I just wanted more from it. Otherwise it would have been probably another 5-star Grady Hendrix read for me. The next book that I read was Love, Pamela by Pamela Anderson. I listened to this on audiobook, and it is narrated by her, and I just love her voice. She has such a sweet voice, and I could listen to her talk all day, honestly. I think Pamela Anderson is a beautiful person inside and out. This is a memoir that she talks about, you know, everything from her childhood up till now. It's mostly in chronological order, but I think that's my only critique, is that at times it kind of jumped around and I got a little bit lost, or like she would mention somebody that was in her life and then just kind of like shift to something else, from one story to the next a little too abruptly. I loved hearing about her experience with Playboy and the Playboy Mansion with Hugh Hefner and on her shows Baywatch, and I forgot that she was part of Home Improvement, that she was like the assistant, I guess, to Tim the Tool Man. I really enjoyed listening to her perspective on motherhood and raising her boys, who are clearly like the love of her life, trying to raise them, you know, with the media and some of the things that went on in the 90s in her relationships and things that got leaked out into the media. If you know, you know. If you like Pamela Anderson, oh, I also wanted to say, like, all of the later in life things that she talked about was all about like her animal advocacy and how important that is to her, advocating for animal rights, and how she's traveled all around the world and been part of different events and protests and things like that. So it was a really interesting read and definitely worth the experience if you like Pamela. Next, I read Water for Elephants by Sarah Gruen. This is a historical fiction and it follows Jacob in kind of like a dual timeline. So we get younger version of Jacob and older version of Jacob. Older version of Jacob is in a nursing home, and it's kind of sad, like, reading that perspective. And then the younger version of Jacob, we're following him as he is a young college student. He's getting ready to finish veterinary school, but then something really tragic happens in his life and he quits vet school very abruptly. He's clearly going through some things, and he just ends up coming across this traveling circus train and decides that he's gonna join them. So then the primary focus of the rest of the book becomes, you know, Jacob's life as part of this circus. He gets hired on as, you know, kind of a helper at first, just kind of doing some of the grunt work, labor type of thing for the circus. They realize that he is this, you know, veterinary school student, and so they hire him to be the vet and help take care of the animals, one of them being an elephant. There is also like a love triangle that he gets involved in with one of the circus performers and her husband, who is like the head over all of the animal trainers and performers and the animals. I actually liked the love triangle part of this, but some of this was just really hard to read, like really depressing. It's set during the Great Depression era. There were a lot of problems that I had with this just overall. There were times where it felt like things were thrown in there, like conflict just for the sake of conflict, which I didn't love. I felt like sometimes we would address things, like especially like at the very beginning, like this tragic event that happens to Jacob that leads him to join the circus, and then it's like as soon as he's on the train, he doesn't ever like think or really talk about or process like that super tragic thing that just happened. It's like he just forgets about it. The author just doesn't really bring it up much after that point. And that happens a lot. Like something will happen that's kind of like a shocking conflict type of moment, but then the next chapter it's as if that never even happened. Like the same characters will be interacting as if nothing happened. It was just kind of weird. I do understand what the author is trying to, you know, like say about the animal abuse, and it really is a good example of why circuses today are moving to like not involving animals at all because of the history of mistreatment from stories like this. And some of the, if you read the Q&A in the back of the book, some of these events that took place are like based on real events that happened to animals on these types of circus trains. I also got really mad at Jacob at times because he is supposed to be the vet and caring for the animals, and it's like he just let some of this abuse happen. Not only were the animals abused, but the people as well. And Jacob like did almost nothing for the majority of the book about any of that. It's like he just was turning a blind eye to it. So I wasn't loving his character either. I gave this a 3.5 star. There were a lot of elements that I did enjoy, like the life of the circus performers on this traveling train and the hardships of the people during the Great Depression era. I liked the love triangle aspect. I liked older Jacob, I think, better than younger Jacob as far as their personalities go. I liked the way that it ended. Just wasn't, you know, wasn't higher than a 3.5 star for me for sure. The next book that I read was The Clinic by Cate Quinn, and this is a thriller that I read for the Sleep When I'm Dead book club. There is an author interview that they did that is out there on Jesse's channel. I'll leave that link down below because it was actually really interesting to hear them talk to Cate Quinn herself. I had never read anything by this author before, but she has written at least one other thriller, Black Widows. I think the cover is just beautiful for this, but this is following two different characters. We have like a dual POV. We have Meg, who is the sister of a famous singer who was basically committed to go through rehab at this place called the Clinic, which is a very like luxury style drug and alcohol like rehabilitation clinic. And so Meg's sister Haley is committed there and ends up dying, and there is some mystery about her death, and Meg doesn't believe that what the media is saying happened. She doesn't believe that that's the real story about how Haley died at the clinic, and so she decides that she is going to get checked in and try to figure out what happened to her sister. But Meg also struggles with addiction. So you're also experiencing Meg on her own rehabilitation journey and kind of finding out more about herself as she's trying to solve this mystery about her sister. The second point of view that we get is from Kara, who is this very like, I think she's like a type A personality type of person who is a new office manager, and she also thinks that there's something fishy going on at the clinic and with the eccentric owner of this clinic and some of his like questionable ways that he treats the patients that are living here. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. This was a 4-star read for me. I think everybody on that live book discussion for that book club gave this like a 4 or 5-star rating. It was really pretty fantastic to see that everybody seemed to unanimously enjoy this book. Some a little bit more so than others. It wasn't a perfect 5-star read for me because I did feel like there were a few chapters, kind of maybe 2/3 or so of the way into the book, where it was clear to me that the author was just really trying to throw us off on who the actual killer was, of what really happened with Haley. You know, it was like, oh, it could be this person, and then the next chapter was somebody else doing something suspicious, and it was just very obvious to me that the only reason that those chapters existed were to throw us off. By that point, I was pretty sure of who I expected the killer to be, but I will say that there was definitely a twist at the end where I was like kind of right, but not all the way. So there was a pretty shocking plot twist for me at the end of this. I really enjoyed this book. I would highly recommend this if you like thrillers. The final book I am probably most excited to talk to you guys about because it's one that you chose for me in my February TBR, like help me choose, where I had you guys pick a different emoji. The choices were Mary Poppins, Pippi Longstocking, Alice in Wonderland, Winnie the Pooh, or Harry Potter, and overwhelmingly so, more than any of the other books, you guys chose for me to read Harry Potter. So I read Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the first book in the Harry Potter series, and I'm happy to say that I get it, you guys. This was a 5-star read for me. I loved this so much. I just feel like J.K. Rowling is a fantastic writer. That was like so clear to me. Having read this book, she just makes it feel so easy and effortless with like the world building. I love that we are learning about, you know, spells and all of the different creatures that exist in this world of wizardry at Hogwarts. We're learning all of that along with our main character, Harry, and I mean, what else do I need to say about this? Everybody, I feel like, knows about the plot of this book. I don't think I really need to explain that to anyone, but I loved the characters. I loved Hermione and how like sassy and kind of stuck up she was. She was like that know-it-all person, and she kind of grew as a character and became a really great friend to Harry and Ron by the end of this. I love that Ron went from being like a younger brother and kind of a little timid to being a very brave character. Harry, you know, his story is just phenomenal to read about as well. I loved all of this so much. So I cannot wait to continue in this series. What more do I need to say? This was a 5-star read and a fantastic way to end the month of February for me. At this point, I'm already a few books into the reading for March, and I can't wait to share those books with you in about a month from now. So be sure to subscribe if you want to see more from me. Give the video a thumbs up because it does help my channel and I appreciate it so much. I'll see you guys again next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.